Hello, welcome to the second part of my video about modern auth with Keycloak and APISIX. So if you haven't watched my first video, I recommend you do so. In this video, I first showed you an overview and then we implemented the first part of the demo application. We went from a setup where we had 3 resources which we wanted to access via a reverse proxy. And we currently arrived at this part here where we have a reverse proxy. In our case, we use an API gateway, which is called APISIX, and we've set up the basic routing. And I showed you how to set up the configuration for that, how the Docker Compose looks. And in today's video, I want to extend the setup and introduce an identity provider. In our case, it will be Keycloak. So we will go to this setup where we have not only the API gateway routing, the access to the different resources, but also having a connection to our identity provider and facilitating basic authentication via OpenID Connect. We're now going to hop in and I show you how to set up Keycloak. So we've already learned how to set up the API gateway APISIX, but today we want to focus on how Keycloak works, how you can configure it, and how APISIX and Keycloak work together. So let's have a look at the current code. So in the current APISIX config, we have, as I said, the basic routes. So we have some forwarding and then the different resources. We also are already using a plugin, proxy rewrite, which makes sure that the URLs as they are passed on to the upstream are correct. Now for Keycloak, for a typical setup, I use Docker, and I want to first show you how to set up the Docker file. So this is the Docker file. I'm currently using Keycloak 26.4, and this here is a layered Docker file. So first we have this builder stage. So this is basically where if you want to deploy Keycloak in a company network, for example, where you have some custom certificates, you could copy them over here and put them in the right folder. And what we also do, we copy the themes, and this is very important here. This setting, the kc_http_relative path, we set it to /IAM. So this is a setting which you need to do in the build stage. So before you call here this build command, we do this because we want to put Keycloak also behind our reverse proxy under the /IAM endpoint. So if we don't do this, the forwarding will not work properly and Keycloak will not know that it is behind this reverse proxy at this URL. We would again have to use rewrites in APISIX. But if we just let Keycloak know that it will be served under a special endpoint, then we don't need to do any rewrites in APISIX. This is also important. We want to use Postgres as our database, and then Docker will first run this build stage, which in the end builds Keycloak with these settings here. And then here we introduce a few more settings. One important is this here, kc hostname strict. This should be set to true in a production environment, so you don't want to have this dynamic, because this is how Keycloak treats the different endpoints it serves, for example, for OIDC and Auth. So there's typically a public endpoint which clients can call to get a list of all the different URLs that Keycloak provides, for example, for getting tokens, for refreshing tokens, for token introspection, and so on. And we want to have all those URLs use a strict fixed Keycloak URL, which we're going to set in the Docker Compose file. So this is important. If you don't set this to true, those URLs will be different depending from where you call it. So this might be interesting if you run it just for a local dev setup, but in production, you should set this to true. In our case also here, this one might be a bit counterintuitive at first, because in production, you surely want to use HTTPS. But as I showed you in the first video, the HTTPS part is handled by APISIX, and everything we have behind the gateway just uses HTTP, which is why we also need to tell Keycloak that this is enabled. Now this setting here, this is important if we want to have the backchannel communication, which happens between APISIX and Keycloak, to use dynamic URLs. So contrary to what I just said here, having this strict hostname, we want to have this backchannel communication use dynamic URLs. Now finally here we define the entry point. We want to start it in optimized mode, and here this proxy headers equals forwarded. This is something you need to set if you want to run Keycloak behind a reverse proxy, in our case APISIX, and then we also set the log level. Now in addition to those settings here, we also make some settings in the Docker Compose file. So let's have a look. So down here is where we define our IAM service, in our case the Keycloak. we set the context to our platform folder where we have the Docker file. And here, those two are important. This is just for the first startup. So when you first start Keycloak, you will have to log in somehow. And in our case, we just define a very simple admin name and password, which is something you should change immediately afterwards. So this is just the first root account which you have. You can also directly use a harder to guess password here. But in any case, after you first use this root account to make the initial setup, you typically would create specific accounts and disable this root account. Now here, this one, the KC hostname, this is what we now use when we have set this strict hostname. So all the URLs Keycloak uses will use this as its root, as its base URL. Then here, those are all database related. And as I said, in the build stage, we set Keycloak to use Postgres. And down here, I have a very simple Postgres container in our demo setup using currently Postgres 14, so not even the latest version. Here we have some very hard to guess password, which we also have to let Keycloak know about. So if you, for example, set this up in Kubernetes, you would use the secret storage for that, create a random password, and then share it with Keycloak. And this way, Keycloak can then use here the Postgres database. Now let's also have a quick look at the documentation, which you should read. So there's the server administration guide for Keycloak, which you can go through. It will explain many of the topics we're gonna just go through very quickly in this video in more detail. So you have role concepts, groups, realms, everything explained. So this is a very important URL. Then another important URL is this one here, and I'll put links to this in the description of the video. Here you have a list of all the different configuration variables, and let's just have a look at the strict setting here, hostname strict. If we open this, you see if you're using the Keycloak CLI, which is also an option, you have to configure Keycloak. You would use -- hostname strict. And if we use environment variables, as we did in the Docker file, we use this environment variable. And here's a list of all the different variables you can set up. There's another important site, which is called Configuring Keycloak for Production. This is also something you should read through. It explains how to set up reverse proxy and different other topics with further links to even more documentation. So you see there's a lot of documentation, and what I want to say about Keycloak, it's very easy to get started, to just set up a Keycloak environment and have the ability to register users and have them log into your application. But to really understand all the features of Keycloak, it really takes time. And in this video, we'll only scratch the surface. So I've now started the Docker Compose, and we still have our resources here. And what we also have now under localhost/IAM, currently route not found. This is where we want to put Keycloak. So let's do this first so we can access our Keycloak admin dashboard to do the configuration. So right here at the top, I'll just put the IAM route. So in the Docker Compose, we call this the IAM service. And for those URIs, I want to have the forwarding directly to the IAM service. Now here's the important part. We don't need to do some proxy rewrite because we already have set up Keycloak to know that it will be served at this endpoint. So let's just save this, go back, refresh the page. And now we end up at this side here. First, we can now use the admin to log in. And for the sake of this demo, I don't change this now. You could now go in and create a user here under the users, make it also an admin user, or you could just properly set up the admin. For example, if you click on it, you can go to the credentials, you can reset the password, and this way make it a little more secure. So currently we see up here this master. It means we're currently in the master realm. The master realm is the main Keycloak administration realm. To this realm, only the admins should have access. So you shouldn't create any further users here. And down here in the realm settings, when we go here, there are a few things we want to set up. What we want to do is typically set up here this email part. And here in your setup, you should have some mail provider with SMTP support, which you can then set up here. So this is the foundation to be able to have Keycloak send out emails. For example, if a user registers, if a user changes passwords, or if you create a user now here, another admin user under users, you want to automatically send an email to this user so it knows he now has an account. You should go there and change the password. For this, you have to set up the email part here. So this is one of the first settings you want to do. You can also go through all the rest here and have a close look, read up on this, but it's not that important to first get started. Now, the first thing we want to do for our demo, we want to go to manage realms here because we don't want to have our applications use the master realm. to log in. We want to create a separate RAM. And you see here there's already a demo RAM, but we not use this one. We create a new RAM now because I want to walk you through it. So you go to create RAM and we call this demo 2. Now that the RAM's created, it automatically becomes the current RAM here. So up here you see which RAM is currently active. And in this RAM, we now want to create clients. First of all, what are RAMs? So RAMs allow you to have multi-tenancy. So you can have different spaces, which are called RAMs in your Keycloak, and those are isolated. If you have users in one RAM, those users don't have access to the clients or can't log in with the clients in another RAM. So in the company, for example, you could have your IT department host a Keycloak, and then for different teams, they could have RAMs if those teams need to manage their own clients, and this way they would be isolated. Now, clients provide a means for applications and users to log in, and you see there are already a few clients active here. So typically each RAM has this here RAM management and a security admin console. Those can be used for RAM admins. So remember, in the master admin, we use the root account to log in and we get access to everything, so to all the RAMs. But you can also set up specific admins that only have access to the RAM in which they are admin, so they can manage the clients and users in that RAM. So this is an important concept for those who have already those two clients. But what we now want to do is we want to create a client with which our APISIX will communicate. So with create client, we're gonna create our demo APISIX. The client ID is very important, should be unique, and this is the one we're gonna use later when we set up the connection. Then we go to next, and here we now define the different flows for login. What we need in our case is just the standard flow, which is a redirect-based flow. We're gonna see how this works in a second when we set it up with APISIX. We also need to switch on client authentication. This makes this client a so-called confidential client, and APISIX will have to use a secret to communicate with this client. It also means that no other users or clients can use this client, only the ones that have the secret. Now we go to next here and have some more important settings. The valid redirect URLs, you should set them up to be specific for your application. In our case, it's just localhost. So everything on the local host is a valid redirect URL. If we set this up wrong, then the whole OIDC connection flow will not work properly. Web origins we'll also set to localhost, and the post logout URL also. Now again, as with the RAM settings, you can go through the different tabs here, have a look and read up on it. But I now want to just focus on the basics that are required to get the connection between APISIX and Keycloak going. So we go here to the credentials tab, and this here is important. Here's already a client secret. Can make this visible. We need to later copy this and use it in APISIX in the OpenID Connect setup, because this enables the communication. This will also be the next step we're gonna do now. So remember, in the first video, we also set up here this config, and we provide several plugins already. And the important one, which we're going to use now, is this one here, the OpenID Connect plugin. And I just want to secure the resource 1 route now. Down here, under the plugins, I'll drop in the configuration for the OpenID Connect plugin, and I'm going to explain what everything of this means. So first of all, there's this bearer only flag. So if you set this to true, then every request coming to this URL needs to have a JWT token already present as bearer, which is not what we want here, because we go to this resource 1 in the browser. So we just go to the URL. We don't have a bearer token yet. Then here, this session secret setting, I provide this via an environment variable. So typically you set this up in a .env file, or as we do here in the Docker Compose, we have several environment variables, and here we just pass this through from our .env file. This APISIX session secret is important. You share this between the different routes where you use this OpenID Connect plugin. This way APISIX knows that it's the same session between those routes, and you don't have to log in when you go to the different routes again and again. The client ID, this is the one we just set up. So the Keycloak client ID, and we have to change this. Currently it still says demo APISIX, but I think we're using lowercase now in our demo 2 client. And this here, the second one, the Keycloak RAM demo 2. So demo was from the previous RAM I'd already created, but as I said, we want to set this up freshly here. So we're using the Keycloak RAM demo 2, and the client is demo APISIX. So those two are passed in here. So we have the Keycloak client and the RAM here. And this variable is used in another place up here in this discover URL. So this discover URL, we're using the Keycloak URL, which is https://8080/IAM, then realms, then the name of the realm, and then this well-known OpenID configuration. So let's just have a look at this one here. I just copy this over. We go to the browser. So this is important. If I use in the browser, I don't use this IAM service :8080. I need to use localhost, but then /IAM/realms demo2 well-known configuration. And you see here, there's a whole bunch of different endpoints defined. And the important part is here, those start with http://localhost IAM. This is the strict URL we have set. Now here the scope, this is what needs to be part of the scope in Keycloak 2. So typically you have OpenID email. You can also have profile here so that more data is exchanged. But this only works if you also set it up to be included in the token scope on the Keycloak side. Let's have a quick look at that, because this can be a problem and lead to unexpected errors. So if you go here under the client, the demo APISIX client, to the client scopes, you see here there's a whole lot of scopes included. And those ones here, which are default, are included in the token. And one thing I would suggest, clean this up in a production setup. Only keep the ones that you really need. But here you see email is included and even profile. So I could also use profile in the setup in APISIX. Now here we need to define a redirect URL, and this is a bit unintuitive when you look at the documentation. So this URL should use the same URL as you have in the upstream and then a unique endpoint. I typically use OIDC. This is basically an endpoint that the OpenID Connect plugin sets up under the hood to use as the redirect URL for its login flow. Also here, you can set a post-logout redirect URL. So if you use the logout functionality of OpenID Connect, after the logout, you'll be redirected to this URL. Now, before we can test this out, we also need to set this client secret. So let's quickly grab this from Keycloak. Let's go to credentials, just copy it, and then update our environment. I've already defined this variable here. It's basically passed through here in Docker Compose and then used in the plugin configuration here. Let's now save this and have a look. We'll now go to localhost. You see I'm directly forwarded here to /IAM/realms demo2, where I have now this login screen. Now the problem is here, I don't have an account yet. So the admin will not work here because this is now a user account inside of the demo2 realm. So let's first make a quick change in Keycloak, go to the RAM settings to login and allow user registration here. Now if we go back here and refresh, you see down here we now have a register button. So I can now register. So here you should put your real email, and if you've set up, as we discussed, the SMTP, which you would also have to do in the demo2 realm, so not just in the master realm, then once this account is registered, you should also get an email. Now let's just register. And we're directly logged in. Now, if we log out, let's see what happens. We're redirected to the /logout route. And here again, we have a route not found. So let's have a look and figure out why this is. So the /logout is the default route that is used for logouts. And we don't have this route here anywhere. So it doesn't exist in our configuration. So let's just set it up. Just put it up here as our logout route, and everything going to the URIs logout and logout star should also be handled by OpenID Connect. So that's important here. For this logout route, we just need to configure the basics here for OpenID Connect. So the session that we have set up down here with the session secret is also known in this route with this plugin, and that it can be properly handled. And here then we have the post logout redirect URL also set up. And if we now save this one, go back to our resource and click on the logout button, we get invalid redirect URI. Now let's have a look why this happens, because I made a little mistake in the creation of the client in Keycloak. So remember here I said how important it is to set valid redirect URIs, but also here for the valid post logout URIs, we have to set them appropriately, and we're just allowing localhost, but not localhost/logout. So I just put a star here because I want to allow anything within our application to be a valid redirect URI. Now if we go back and click on logout, it works. So let's give it another try, because I also want to show you something which can happen. Sign in, press OK, logout. So I clicked on logout, but nothing happens. And this is something very important, because this has something to do with caching. So remember, in our APISIX YAML file, we have set up here this route forward. So what we now do, we log out and we get redirected here to this logout route. Here, the session is basically invalidated, and then we're redirected to the base URL, which is this here, which directly forwards us again to resource 1. What can happen here that some browsers will have caching active, and we will see the cached resource 1 with the cached cookie. So you're directly back at this page. So it looks as if you're logged in. So if we look at the DevTools here under application, localhost cookie, there is no cookie left, but still we're here in the logged in route. If we do logout now, we get invalid token hint because, yeah, there's no session active. To avoid this invalid state where you access a cached page to which you have been logged in before and you return to it without a cookie and then your complete login logout flow is broken, you should disable caching for those OpenID Connect routes which you use for login with the redirects. So let's just go here to the top of the YAML file and insert here some definition. Response rewrite disable cache, and we set the cache control to no cache, no store, must revalidate. And with this, we will use a plugin now here for our resource 1 route, which is called the response rewrite plugin. And we use the definition we did at the top. And I do this here because then we can also use it with the other routes. So I can just also copy this here. And by the way, let's also copy the OpenID Connect part. First of all, let's move this down here, copy this whole block and put it also to resource 2 and resource 3. Quickly change the path here. Save it. Now go back to the browser. So if I refresh, I'm now stuck here in this invalid state. So let's clear the cookies, go back to localhost. Now do a fresh login, sign in, go to one of the other resources, press logout. Now we're back here at the sign in page, log in again, 1, 2, 3, 4, sign in, switch between resources, logout, and now it properly works. Now this is a very important setting, which first time I had to figure out myself. And I just found out about how to solve this because I switched from Chrome to Firefox, which uses some other caching policies. And there it worked, but it didn't work on Chrome, which helped me to figure out what the problem was and also how to solve it. So typically for the one URL where you do the redirecting for login, you should disable the cache. If you're also familiar with APISIX and you know another way to do this, just let me know. But for me, this was the quickest solution. And also, if you have a lot of resources which you still want to cache, so for example, here under resource 2/star, you might have a folder assets and where images are downloaded for which you want the caching, then put those in a separate route and there you can leave the caching active. So this would be a possible solution. But I think for now, this is enough for this video. We have now arrived at the stage where we have proper authentication for different resources. We have proper logout. We have set up Keycloak with a basic client. And as I said, there's a lot of documentation for Keycloak, which you can explore. Also, I leave a link to my repository with the final version where you can already check out how authorization is set up, which we're not going to do in this video. This will be in a separate video. So now we have the authentication, which identifies the users of our application. Next, what we also want to do, we want to include some role-based access for the different resources. This will be part of the next video.